Scott Young, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with me. I'm excited to dive into your new book because the last book was so powerful. It's impacted so many people.
Oh,
And
thank you.
one place I would love to start is
Mhm.
something that I came across last year that I really realized was a lot of people rely on consistency and they think that's the thing that's going to help them get to where they want to
Mm,
go.
yeah.
But it just isn't the way that's going to get people to the results that they want. You talk a little bit about that in your new book, but why isn't it that people can't just rely on consistency?
Well, I mean, it's one of those things. I tend to be one of these people that's more of like a there's kind of thinkers that are like there's team X and team Y, and they're like I'm team X, and I like sort of maybe to my own detriment as someone who writes stuff online, but I tend to be the person like how can both X and Y be both true, right? And then that makes things more confusing, which probably doesn't help you sell books. But my feeling about habits is that habits are a very powerful tool. So I think that's what we're talking about. We're talking about consistency, like this idea of behavioral automaticity, of like getting things to the point where they're low effort. You're not thinking about them that much. You're just doing them for a long period of time. They can be incredibly powerful tools. And I think especially when we're talking about self-improvement, getting your life together, they're often a very important first step. I mean, that's how I got started in this. Like one of my first essay series that was popular on my website was talking about like all these kind of 30-day trials I was doing, like making new habits and stuff. And I think that's a very common cycle. So, you start doing these things, you start building habits, and that really also gives you this confidence like, oh, I can actually change things in my life. I can actually like have agency and like go out and say, I'm going to, exercise every day for a month. And then you do that. And then I'm going to like eat better and then read and do this. And you do all these things and they stack on top of each other and you think they're so great. Now, like all things, though, there's a kind of prescribed zone where this sort of thing works, and there's places where it doesn't work. So one of the things that I'm a little bit skeptical of is that obviously when you're designing a habit, you want to make it something you can sustain in theory indefinitely. And the issue is just that a lot of habits are time consuming. So if I am doing language practice, for instance, that takes time out of my schedule. And if I'm doing, I have several goals that I have in life, which most of us do. We're not, totally single-minded about things. In order to make them fit, we have to keep reducing the commitment, make it even smaller, even lower footprint, lower effort. And I think that this scaling down of reducing the amount of effort can, in some cases, sort of undermine what you actually need to do to make improvement. So while it is certainly the case that if you are starting a business, there's probably a lot of good habits to have in building a business, and you do need to have consistency over a period of time. It's not going to happen overnight. It is also probably not the case that if your idea is that I'm going to work on my business for 10 minutes a day and then I'm going to have a successful business in X years, that's just a fantasy, I think. Like it tends to require a lot of effort. And so I think sometimes the dialogue around habits, particularly not habits in general, but particularly this mindset of, well, I want to do something perpetually and therefore it has to be extremely low footprint, very easy, very effortless, this sort of small increment. There's this sort of logic going on in the background that, well, I'll reach my destination eventually. It'll just take me a little longer. And I just think that's not true. I think there's sort of like a phase change that if you're not putting in a certain minimum amount of effort, some goals just don't happen, even if you spend a lot of time doing them. And that could be because, if you're just the thing that you can fit into 10 minutes a day is just not covering all of the activities that you need to do, or there's some planning complexity or this kind of thing. So again, I don't want to be dismissive of habits. I think that they're incredibly important. And I think, there's lots of things in our life where habits really are the solution. If you want to be like generally in good shape, habits are the thing that you need to do. But if you were trying to be like, I want to be an Olympic sprinter, then you're going to need some habits. You're going to need a lot more than habits. And there's a lot of goals that I think they just have threshold effects where it's going to be difficult to get to that point. Now, we can stretch the definition of what we're talking about here. Like, I could argue that, this project I did a decade ago where I was in another country and we were doing this not speaking English, only speaking the other language. That is a habit in a certain sense, but that's not what I'm talking about here. I'm talking about this like, I want to meditate for 5 minutes a day. And it's just, to me, I'm skeptical that 5 minutes a day of meditation is bringing you closer to enlightenment. But, that's just me.
Yeah, no, I love it. There's so many directions I want to go with this. And
Okay.
I'm so grateful that you brought up your experiments because I had James Altucher on probably last year on the show, and
Yeah.
I asked him about the 10,000 hour rule, right? Where like Malcolm Gladwell talks about it. Everyone believes in it, but
Yeah.
his perspective on it was that it's not 10,000 hours, but it's 10,000 experiments. It's 10,000 iterations, like doing
Mhm.
different things so
Yeah.
that you can really learn the skill from your MIT challenge to learning the language. What do you feel? Do you think that, I guess, experiments are the correct route to go? Do you feel like you learn a lot more when you engulf yourself into something?
I mean, yes, I think you do want to try a lot of things out, and I think you do want to experiment. Um, again, I don't know. I don't want to be like, it's kind of lame to say this, but just like, it depends is the answer, because of
Yeah.
course there's certain things. Well, here's the thing. I would say there's lots of problems. There's lots of issues I take with the 10,000 hour rule, but one of the things that I would take with it is it sort of suggests that just doing something a lot is what makes people really good at stuff. And I think this mixes up necessary and sufficient criteria, right? That it's necessary to do something a lot to get really good at it, but it's certainly not sufficient. And even Anders Ericsson, whose research was what was like kind of the inspiration for a lot of Gladwell's research in outliers. I mean, even Anders Ericsson himself, it doesn't believe that. Like he really does not believe that just doing something a lot counts for reaching world class status. So he had this whole theory of deliberate practice that, well, it wasn't just practice; it was a specific type of like um, practice under the guidance of a coach with immediate feedback that's like effortful and really hard to do. And I mean, we can debate whether or not that's the end all be all of learning as well. But I think it also depends on the skill we're talking about too. Like one of the things that I think is often missed is that you can focus on skill in domains where it's like extremely proceduralized. And so practice is important for proceduralizing skills. So if you want to be like fluent in a language, you need a lot of practice because the fluency itself requires a lot of iterations to get to the point where you can do it really quickly. But if I'm talking about, I don't know, I'm making, writing a book about history. Let's use that as an example. There's not that much that's proceduralized there. Like it's mostly like knowledge that you have in your head. I mean, you need to know it. And so you need to be able to like traverse this knowledge structure, but it's not like the work that a historian has to do is deliberate practice in the way that the work that a concert pianist is doing is deliberate practice. So I think in some ways too, it helps to have a finer grained approach at like not looking at excellence or skills as being this like extremely simple thing that we're trying to improve, but rather there's lots of different components of it. And so depending on what you're trying to get good at, the way you're going to get good at it is going to also vary as well.
Yeah, the signaling theory from your book I thought was really, really fascinating. Because I find it like a lot of people. I think it's a massive reason you wrote the book is that people think that we transferable skills are more common than they really are.
Mm.
But I don't think people really understand what the difference is between skills and signals. Do you mind breaking that down?
Yeah. Well, I mean, so signaling comes from economics, and the basic idea is that. So, if I'll use this in the education context, although there's a sense of signaling which applies more broadly than this, but um, the idea is why do people go to school? Or more accurately, why do people who go to school seem to earn more money? Because that's sort of often what the economists are trying to figure out. And there's basically three stories you could tell about this. So, one is the human capital story. This is the one that we grow up hearing, which is that you go to school to learn things, and learning useful things makes you more productive as an employee because you're smarter, math, reading, this kind of stuff, and because you're smarter, you get more important work done, and therefore you are being paid more because of the skills that you learned in school. Second story is an ability story. This is the idea that it just happens to be that the people who go to school are also more productive workers. So school doesn't do anything. If those same people didn't go to school, they would earn the same amount of money, but they are, they're just smarter people, right? And you could make arguments for that as well, that smarter people like school more, and so maybe it's just the case that smarter people make more money and they also like school more. The signaling story is different. The signaling story is saying that you have to go to school to earn more money, but it's not because it's teaching you something useful. It's teaching you something else. It's basically proving that you already had these abilities. So employers, when they're looking at people who are applying for jobs, don't know who's going to be a good worker and who's not. And people always say nice lies about themselves in interviews and this kind of thing. And so when you're talking to people and you're trying to filter through them, you are going to use the fact that they went to college and got a college degree, or even more than that, that they like graduated top of their class or this kind of thing, as evidence that they have these sort of generic raw abilities, that they're conscientious, they're smart, maybe they're also a bit of a conformist, they're likely to like slot into your hierarchy pretty well, they're not someone who, you know, couldn't stick through blind rule following for a number of years, and so they're going to be a good worker based on those properties. But I don't care about anything they actually learned in school.
Mm.
And so Brian Kaplan, I mean, the signaling argument and these theories have been around for a while in academia. Brian Kaplan made kind of the most vociferous case that it's signaling, like that explains education. Now, I tend to think Brian Kaplan's ratio is about like 80% signaling to about 20% human capital. I think that's, I tend to be a little bit, I don't tend to not be that extreme about it, but it seems undeniable to me that, you know, credentials play a large role in things, and especially when the education is not like a vocational education. You know, like if I go to school and I'm in an electrician school, for instance, I would expect that to have pretty high amount of human capital because they're actually teaching you a lot of stuff you're going to use on the job. It's more, the thing that's more kind of debatable is, you know, the person who got a philosophy undergrad from Harvard is probably going to make a lot of money when he or she graduates from university, but it's I don't know, it's pretty hard to see how, you know, knowing Kant and and Plato and, you know, being able to talk about deontological ethics, like that's going to help you, you know, master the corporate world. Now, maybe I'm wrong, but so there's some arguments. So he makes that sort of a strong case against signaling, but I would not say it's an open and shut case, but that's just sort of to articulate what that idea is.
Yeah, yeah, it's fascinating to me because I feel like I started to learn more when I left school than when I was actually in school. Like the
Yeah.
school of actual life taught me more than, you know, and
Yeah.
that includes, you know, reading your books and other people's books and listening to podcasts and hiring mentors and coaches, and you talk about that in the book as well.
Hmm.
I find that is much more of applicable to real life. I think we
Yeah.
learned a lot of things, and I didn't go to college, but a lot of things in,
Mm.
in school where I'll never apply it. I'll never think about it. I probably forgot 99% of it. So, in your
Yeah.
perspective, what do you think are the skills that should be taught in school?
Yeah, it's interesting. So some of them is not like there's broader questions I think about like what our education system is trying to achieve. And these are hard questions to answer because people have very different answers about like what the goal of education is.
Yeah.
So I mean, obviously if the goal was business preparedness, like the reason we were teaching students was to make them maximally productive office workers, then kind of the way we design schools doesn't make any sense, right? Like they have a lot of norms and kind of cultural behaviors that are very different from the working world. So we'd want to change that. And we teach people a lot of skills that don't have a lot of like pragmatic value and this kind of thing. But I mean, when you go and you talk to people, aside from like a few, you know, really economics minded people, almost nobody has this goal for work, right? We have different ideas about what education is for. And so I think designing school is hard because it's, you know, especially a public education system, we're trying to make it universal, and just people have very different values about what they care about. You know, I was just on a podcast where someone was talking about like these extremely intense athletic coaching systems. So like you go to some like hockey school that they're going to turn you into like a really good hockey player. And in some sense, I'm interested in that and I admire it just because I'm interested in learning and skill development. But I'm also kind of, my personal persuasion is that like no one's like almost no one who's in this camp is going to be a professional hockey player. So like you're just optimizing for the wrong thing, right? And so I can be kind of dismissive of that. And I can be like, you know, it's probably better to just like, how can you learn enough hockey that you enjoy the game and then just let kids have fun? Like that's probably better in my mind for things.
Yeah.
But, you know, I'm a bit of a snob about like sort of intellectual skills. So if someone were telling me, oh, well, we shouldn't really be teaching kids math, you know, we should just be teaching them, you know, you can just count on your fingers, this kind of stuff. I mean, that's maybe a bit extreme, but I tend to be a little bit more like, no, but these things are actually valuable, even though, you know, with math, I mean, most people don't use like beyond fractions, and like most people don't even use algebra at all, right?
No.
And algebra is like not even that far up the hierarchy of things. And algebra, it's a little bit like the hockey example, but a bit broader, that like algebra is useful for certain quantitative professions and it's maybe useful in some real life activities if you stretch it a little bit, but that's probably it. And so we're essentially training everyone to be good at these things when, maybe only I don't know what the percentage would be. Let's say like 30% of people are going to have a job that maybe uses algebra. Maybe I'm overestimating that too. But that's so that's a question about education that I think is hard to deal with. Now, Brian Kaplan, who writes about this signaling idea, has this sort of perspective of like, okay, because a lot of it's signaling, we should just sort of like massively defund education and have less stuff. I tend to think that I don't think that his argument is as strong there. And I think that there's quite a bit of evidence that education, yes, individual stuff is wasteful, but giving people broad education, giving people access to knowledge and learning, it's one of the few things that when you show like these sort of naturalized experiments where you give people just sort of like your birthday was this cutoff and then you got an extra year of school or 1 year less of school, the people who got more school have slightly higher IQ. And so there is probably something that like educating has this sort of civilizing force. It has this sort of probably these useful things. Now, I think on the margin, whether we're doing too much of it or we're doing too much school learning or we should have more things, I think I would prefer if we lived in a world where there was a little bit less conformity and there was more variety, more options. I tend to dislike the elitism inherent in education. And so, there was like when coding boot camps were coming out, there's a lot of people like, oh, coding boot camps, that's not a real education, this kind of thing. I'm like, why can't we have diversity? Why can't we have different ways of trying to teach things and then, see what pans out, see what employers value, see what people like. I tend to be pluralistic about it.
Yeah, I think that's my hesitation to it is we don't get to choose what we learn, and so we learn things that maybe we're not really ever going to apply. But you started writing online in your last year of high school, and then by college you were making a living off study advice, the courses and stuff like that. Like you got started really early. What were some of the early lessons that you learned from writing because you've been at it for 15 plus years?
Oh, wow. Well, one lesson is that if you want to start a blog, 2006 was a good time to do it.
Right.
No, I mean, it's sort of funny because the internet ecosystem has changed so much since when I started. Like I joke to people that like if I were a kid today, it's not obvious to me that I would be in this profession because the internet that I grew up on was this like place for, somewhat technologically sophisticated internet weirdos. And so it was like full of like just strange people who were just talking about ideas that like didn't fit in with the regular discourse. And now, not that I'm like super far out there, but I'm definitely like kind of more on the nerdy sort of, weirdo spectrum of things. And now the internet is like, it's so normie. It's so like jocks and high school cheerleaders. And like you go on Instagram and it's just sort of like, if I were like, 17 today scrolling through this would not be like where I'd want to be like hanging out and stuff. So it's sort of ironic that like, this is where I find myself, that like, this is what I'm doing, is that I'm like an influencer in some sense. But I don't feel like I fit that typical profile. So I was really at home, I think, on the internet when it was starting out. And those ecosystems still exist. In some ways, they're just like kind of like everyone just got on board on the internet. And so, I think the environment has changed quite a bit. I think that my main advice is if you're going to do something like this, which is a weird move that probably isn't going to pay off and is like, I can't justify telling some young person to be like, oh yeah, go into YouTube. I mean, maybe if I can see that you just have this like rare 0.01% talent, it's like, okay, yeah, you can do this. You'll be successful at it. I mean, most people who do it are going to fail. So the right attitude to have is that you should enjoy failing at it. Like it should be something that like you enjoyed as a hobby. You got to meet cool people. You got to do fun stuff. And I mean, I think that's a healthier attitude to have toward it. I think, I did try to, when I was starting out, I was thinking, okay, I'm going to grow a business. I want to do this full time. But I think probably a better attitude to have at the time would have been to, do it because you enjoy it, really enjoy doing it. And then, use that as a platform for getting other opportunities in your life, because certainly the world as it is right now, there's so many people who are trying to break in on that field, and I don't know, most people are not going to be successful at it. And so if you have that as your like, that's my criteria for wanting to do this, I think you're going to be disappointed.
Yeah, I think with podcasting as well, it's just there's so many people trying to do it nowadays that it's so overly saturated.
Yeah.
Unless you've been doing it for a long period of time, I think the same thing. I could imagine you and like Mark Manson and those kind of people, like Cal Newport, like 15 years ago, writing online. Just like very very little amount of people that are doing that, and to see what you guys
Yeah.
have built today is really really profound. And I know that your way of writing from blogging to writing a book is much different. How
Yeah.
has your writing in general kind of changed over time? Because I could imagine you're writing from a different viewpoint when you're trying to speak from blogging to
Well, yeah. I mean, my only rule for writing has always been write the stuff that I like to read. So I think my
mm,
writing has shifted as the kind of stuff I like to read has shifted too. Like my early writing, very early writing was very inspired by kind of like a lot of personal development bloggers circa like 2006. So it's a lot of, unsupported opinions and, like, but this was the stuff that resonated with me. And so I
mhm,
tried to emulate it in my writing. And then when I was doing the MIT challenge and these language learning projects and these big challenges, I was heavily influenced by people who were also doing that. So I liked Benny Lewis doing his Fluent in 3 Month challenges. I liked Josh Kaufman's personal MBA. I liked these people who were like out there doing things and then like, this is what I'm doing. This is my progress. And I feel like more recently I've had a little bit of an academic turn in a lot of
mhm,
my stuff because that's what I enjoy reading. Like I enjoy someone who like has spent 30 years really thinking through this problem and really like understanding what every single argument is about this problem and what everyone has to say about it and like coming up with some kind of conclusion and basing it on data. Like I think I've come to appreciate science a lot more. And so my work has sort of cited a lot more science, not just because I'm like, oh, well, I want to see more scientific, but because I want to write the kind of thing that I would like to read. And I don't want to read just my opinion, So that's what I'm trying to do. So my only advice to people is not to like do what I'm doing or write the way that I'm writing or that's argue that that's good or not good, but to just try to get in tune with what you like that you see other people doing and to be sensitive to that. Because I think the first step to making something good is to have taste. And you can't have taste if you're not really paying attention to like, well, why do I like this? What do I like about it? What is the kind of thing that I would like to bring out of my own work? And I think that's sort of the process of trying to make things.
yeah. Your parents were school teachers, and like I said, you
Hmm.
got started really really young, in writing and in making
Yeah.
courses and everything. Like, did you imagine yourself down this path? Like, would you see yourself as a best-selling author, like where you are now?
The writing kind of came accidentally. I feel like
Mm,
not that I see myself more as a writer than as an entrepreneur now because even though I have a business and it is technically what I do for a living, it's not like the business part of it is less the focus of my work.
yeah.
I need to do it to make a living, but it's not. I know there's people who have the opposite focus that like the writing is just sort of like I'm making content, and then they're very
Mhm.
very interested in the business and business systems and stuff. And so I don't know. I'm more interested in ideas, but the the thing that I started out as when I was around 15 or 16, I'd heard about people running solopreneur businesses. So they were, and this was in the first context that I heard about this was people making video games. So like they were making little, Steve Pavlina was one of the first people who was. So that's how I got into personal development too, because he was writing about like how to set up a software business, and then he started talking about personal development, and so I started reading that as well. And there was a couple things that I liked about that. So I'd always had this. I don't want to say DIY, but I've always had this kind of like I like just coming up with things and then just making them. And so the business end of that, it provided this, I think, interesting puzzle on top of that, because I think with a lot of artistic or creative work, they can kind of be untethered from any kind of objective standard, which that's fine for some people. But to me, I like problems that have some kind of objective standard to them. And so
Yeah.
when you're running a business and you make something and either like it's popular or it's not popular, there's this kind of like final verdict on it, which is not the same. At least at the time, I was thinking it had more objectivity than you know. Can I get one person, to like some teacher to give you an A+ or some employer to like, oh, this person's brilliant, we're going to hire them, that kind of thing. It was more meritocratic. At least that was my thinking back then. I'm not sure I think that now, but that was sort of my inspiration, is that like I saw people doing this and I was like, oh my God, I want to do that. Like I want to have my own business, and that's what I do. So I mean, I'm not a solopreneur anymore. I have, I have team members, but that idea of like, I think I still have that same passion for, here's an idea, let's go make that, and then like
Yeah.
maybe people will like it. And I still get that joy, I think, from doing things that like just think up wild projects, like, and that's I think why I like the course business too, because I like writing the books, but they're traditional. There's something more constraining. Whereas when you're coming up with a course, you like, it could be anything. It could be
Mhm.
video, it could be audio, it could be email. You could be like, how are we going to teach this, and what are we going to teach, and how are we going to do it, and so you can really let your imagination run wild. And so, I mean, that's what's drawn me into this, and I've just been very lucky that I've been able to do it for so long.
Yeah, I mean, man, you're impacting so many people for a good reason. You've been able to stay in it for a long time for a good reason, right? I mean, I love your work. I think a lot of
Oh,
people are
thank you.
fascinated with your work, and I mean, the difference I think with you and so many people is that you've done the work, right? Like you've done the MIT challenge. You went through MIT in 12 months rather than 4 years. You've done the
Yep.
language experiments and everything. So you have the context to talk about it because you've done some of it too.
Yeah.
Knowing that you have done some challenges that people look at even to this day that you did many, many years ago and still ask you about, there's a reason they
Yeah.
ask you about it. Like, what do you feel most people misunderstand when it comes to learning about, like, learning to feel
Oh.
things?
Oh. Well, I mean, there's lots of things we could get into there. I think it's always a little bit funny for me for these challenges, because especially something like the MIT challenge, like people still ask me questions about it. But now this is over a decade ago. Like, I was a kid when I did that, and
Exactly. Yeah.
I'm a man with thinning hair and two small children at home now. So I'm like, I'm sort of talking about a different person who did that.
Yeah.
I mean, I I am not. I'm still like, I can remember doing it, but at the same time, I think as those things recede into my past, I do try to be forward looking. Like, I never want to be ungrateful for the success that some of those things got me, and I am really grateful that people still find it and still find it exciting. Um, but I'm also aware that like they were a product of that time period of my life and that way of thinking about it, and so I don't know whether I would approach things the same way if I were to go about them again. And it's not just like I did it wrong, but just that I'm in a different place in my life and different way of thinking about things. So, I mean, but both of those projects, because they were the year long ones I did, they were, I don't know, they were just like such a fun, exciting part of my life. And I think that's the kind of thing that I would give as a recommendation to anyone who is, modestly clever and is not like crushed by obligations in their life. Use your 20s to do like weird things, because you have your whole life to just be like a ladder climbing conformist, but that there's a window in your life when you're sort of finished school, but you haven't gotten like really serious yet in a career, that
Mhm.
you can waste a year or two doing something that turns to not pan out, and it'll still be a positive life experience. Whereas for me right now, like I feel like my life is in a different situation a little bit, that even if I wanted to, like, to just, okay, I'm going to drop everything and like learn MIT's, I'm going to learn their biology curriculum. There's just so much more weight of like, well, that's just super wasteful. Whereas that when I was 24, when I was doing it, it just felt very much like, well, whatever, right? Like, I can do this. It's fine. And so I think that would be my advice, is that there's sort of a time and place for taking advantage of those kind of ambitions. And so, someone who's young like yourself should really just like, swing for the fences on weird stuff, because sometimes it'll pan out. And even when it doesn't, it'll still be a cool story.
I found travel is a big thing that has
Yeah.
really taught me a lot. And when I'm in Hawaii now, but when I go back home, I was just speaking with my health coach, and I'm going to do a week in a Buddhist monastery and just
Nice.
experience that. Like, just like talking with you, listening to you, like the experiments that you do, I think are so powerful. Is there an experiment that you look back now and you wish you had done, or you feel it would really be helpful for a lot of people?
I mean, there's always projects that I, imagine undertaking, or I'd like to undertake. I don't know. Yeah, I can't think, because there's like, in some ways there's just too many. There's like,
Yeah.
if you were to ask me like, oh, what things would I like to learn? Like, well, I don't know. I had ideas about, after the MIT challenge, I was thinking, oh, maybe it would be nice to follow that up with like, being a professional software developer. Like in some ways that project was kind of half complete because I did all this academic training, but then I didn't like go out in the world and like build software. Or, now I'm like following a lot of the stuff that's happening in AI and machine learning. And, part of me is just sort of like, oh man, I could have been, doing that, because 10 years ago I was starting to learn those things. And if I had like just gone all in and in that stuff, then I would have been maybe well situated to be where these things are now. But instead I chose this path in life. And so I think there's always those like paths not taken. I mean, even for myself, when I did the year without English, where we were learning the languages, I had kind of in my head, oh, I might keep doing this, not like always, but just like I might do some more extended stays and live in other places and learn the language. And it was sort of like right around that time that I started dating my now wife. And it just became kind of like, well, we're just started dating. I don't want to be like, okay, I'm going to go run off to this place and speak this language that no one speaks here. So I just think, in life, you kind of, I think my broad takeaway, I guess, from doing my experiences is not that you can't do these things later, because you certainly can do things like this, but that there is a season in your life where, when you're young, where, sometimes it can feel like, oh, I'm not successful yet. I don't have a lot of like, people don't respect me or esteem me, or like, you want these things, these accomplishments, you want to achieve something in your life or to be successful or to do these kind of things, but you also don't realize that you have this incredible freedom. And so if you just have the gutsiness to just sort of do some of these things, like, I mean, those can end up being some of those experiences for your life that are going to be truly defining. And so starting a business, going to live in another country, learning another language, spending 6 months on some career pursuit that's probably not going to work out, but you're doing it anyways. I mean, you got to pay the bills. You got to, like, I don't want to be dismissive to anyone who feels like they have constraints that prevent them from doing anything. But I do think there's a kind of a moment in your life where, especially if you live in a developed country, I mean, your living expenses are low. You have very few responsibilities. It really just, I think if you have the confidence to do it, you can probably do a lot of those things. And so take advantage of those, I think would be my advice.
Such amazing advice. I think I'm so grateful that I got into this space so young, because I realize it now, and a lot of people get into work that they just don't enjoy, and that's why you've been able to still be excited about an idea and write about it and talk about it and provide value to
Yeah.
people for it. This book seems to be the biggest piece of work that you put out into the world.
Yeah.
Like several hundred scientific papers. You
Yeah.
like you said, you did a lot of just academic research for this. Was there
Yeah.
a piece of research or something, insight that really surprised you? You want to go through it?
I mean, this is a cop out, but kind of everything in the book is something that surprised me. Like I didn't include it if I thought it was obvious or boring.
Yeah.
Cognitive load theory was a huge one for me, because I'd written ultra learning and I'd read all this stuff about retrieval practice and transfer, and this like idea that, oh, well, you got to do a lot of practice, and it's better to solve the problem than to have it shown to you. Like, these were things that I kind of believed. And then so to encounter all this research is like, actually there's situations where you don't want to do that, and that this is not just sort of like this weird edge case, but this more general principle that most of what we know comes from other people, and so we need to, like, this observational learning is super important. And in fact, it's probably the barrier in most of these ill-defined skills that we actually really care about, because if you don't know the method, if you don't know the cutting edge techniques, if you don't have access to the knowledge, then you could be the smartest genius in the world and you're not going to like bootstrap that knowledge. So that was a really important one, and I think that was underrated in my last book. Things like Dean Simonton's work on the equal odds baseline. I thought that was super interesting and non-intuitive, that like people have this productivity slope in their career, so they sort of ramp up and then they have this peak productivity and then it like slowly trails off in their career, but the quality ratio is pretty flat. Like it's not the case that people are just like getting a lot better or getting worse or having some weird kind of like getting better than getting worse function. No, it's just sort of like you're rolling the dice, which when I reflect on my own career, it seems to be the case for my own career too. It's not like now that I have 15 years of experience, I'm like reliably producing more hits. Like I had hits when I was younger, I had hits now. They're different. My writing style is different, but there's something like, I don't know, mildly depressing about that. Like you'd like to think that, oh, I'll be able to crack the code and just only have successes. But when it's a creative pursuit, when you're making things that are new, I think, so that was something that was interesting. The research on exposure therapy, I mean, I'd heard of it before, but it surprised me how robust it was and how deep the research was, and also how important it was, because I think we live in a culture where this sort of, if not said explicitly, the tacit kind of signal is that we're very vulnerable to things, and experiencing things that might be fearful or stressful is going to cause trauma and damage to us. And I don't want to be totally dismissive of that, because certainly if you have really negative experiences in life, it can create fears, it can create trauma. But just the research being that actually exposing yourself to things that are scary is one of the best ways to overcome your fear. And this is like a robust conclusion that we've come from. It has this sort of like, this is not the cultural zeitgeist we're in. And so that one was very interesting to me too. So I mean, part of this book was just reading stuff and cataloging what was interesting and trying to assemble it into a framework that made sense at a high level. I mean, in some ways it's sort of self-indulgent writing a book like this, because in some ways this is writing a book is for me to like try to find interesting things and trying to weave them together, and not like it's something that I enjoy as a process, like learning about this stuff.
Yeah. One of the things that I was really fascinated by was that poker players make better predictions than psychiatrists.
Yeah. Well, it's a comparison. So, I mean, I'm not saying there's like a head-to-head comparison of like, make
Sure.
these predictions and the psychiatrist warning, but essentially the sort of body of research is that there's a lot of research on expertise about how people who have a lot of experience in domain are like so much better at problem solving. They can, look at a physics problem and they just know the answer. And there's lots of research on that. But then there's this sort of like dark half, this other side of it, which is about how bad experts are.
Hmm.
And, I talk about Paul Meal's work, where basically you get these like highly paid trained experts to make these decisions about parole decisions or hiring decisions or whatever it is, and you compare that to just like a pros and cons tally for each person, and the pros and cons tally like does about the same. And then if you make it a little bit more complicated, so you maybe have like a weighted tally, it does even better. And this is just surprising. This is surprising. And it was surprising for me as well, because my assumption kind of going into it is that, this is a little technical, but that what we're doing when we get a lot of repeated practice, repeated experience, is something like a aggregation. This is machine learning. This is what's popular right now. You're like aggregating all this information, and you're just like slowly fine tuning this like perfect intuitive model of the world. And so this research was like, no, this is not what people are doing. They are not doing that.
Yeah.
We have good evidence that is not what they're doing. That's not how intuition works. And and so the idea here is that when you're learning in an environment of uncertainty, meaning that the same action doesn't always produce the same result. There's noise in the system. And when we're learning in an environment where there's a lot of different cues you can pay attention to, and they all matter a little bit, but they're not like there's no sort of, oh well, if the person is in this situation, then do this. It's more
Mhm.
like, well, there's these 15 factors that make someone a good employee, and you each have to weight them all a little bit. Turns out people are really bad at learning in this domain. But in particular, we're really bad at learning in these things if we can't get adequate feedback, if we can't get calibrated feedback to learn from it. So poker players are sort of a counterexample, where you have another uncertain domain where there's lots of hidden information. But until very recently, it was very difficult to make computer programs that could be experienced poker players, just because you're getting that feedback, you're able to calibrate yourself in the game. So I sort of use this as an example, but it just goes to show that just because you do something a lot doesn't make you good at it. I mean, we're talking about the 10,000 hour rule, but that's sort of case in point. You can spend 10,000 hours making bail decisions and not get any better at it, and be super confident that you're the best
Mhm.
at it. Because you're not getting this feedback, you're not getting calibrated.
Yeah, the idea that experts aren't the best teachers was something I found, like, it makes sense. I mean, it makes sense, and to some extent, we think that the experts are the best teachers because they have, quote unquote, the most knowledge, maybe.
Mm-hmm.
But that knowledge kind of seems to be invisible when that's just what they do, right? And so it's a bit difficult. So when someone's trying to get feedback to improve in something, is it best to get someone that's beside them, that is just where they are, a few steps ahead,
Yeah.
10,000 steps ahead?
Well, it depends. I mean, so I'm realizing that I should have underscored this point a little bit better. Like, a few people I've been having podcast conversations that brought up the point you said have said something like, well, why experts are the worst teachers or something like this. And it's like, well, clearly that's not true. The worst
Yeah.
teachers are people who know nothing, right? Like, I don't want to be like, oh, I'm going to be taking a physics lesson from this astrologer or something like this. Like, that's not good. I mean,
Right,
I'm
right.
not going to learn a lot in that situation. So it's not that experts are the worst teachers. It's just that teaching is an additional skill. That it's not enough to know a skill yourself. You also have to be able to like kind of reverse engineer your own skill and break it down so that
Mhm.
someone who doesn't have it can ascend that ladder in a kind of comprehensible fashion. And so there's a general tendency, I don't want to overstate it, but there's a general tendency for skills to become more automated, less effortful, um, more unconscious, meaning that when you solve a problem, you skip over more steps. You combine steps 1 through 5. You do them in one go. This is a sort of a general tendency to skills. There's a lot of knowledge that still remains explicit. So even if you talk to a physics expert, it's not like they just do it in a trance. Like they still know a lot of physics. But then in that case, the problem is that you know too much and you don't know what the person doesn't know. And
Mhm.
so in this case, it's not exactly that, you can't learn from experts, but it just shows why we often want a teacher or a coach and not just, oh, I'm going to just learn in the field. Because the person who learns in the field, like you have to have almost a special skill of extracting what that person knows that goes above and beyond them just knowing the skill. And so I think this is part of the reason why in like sort of apprenticeship type contexts, you have all this sort of, I guess you could call it like kind of tacit knowledge communication, because the expert can't even always articulate, why you're doing something this way, or, maybe they just think it's obvious. And so they're not going to explain it to you. And so I think this is one reason why you want to seek out good teachers, and those aren't always the same people as the best performers.
Such an amazing distinction. Because you used an example of Tiger Woods, how he kind of had to unlearn and start kind of from
Hmm.
scratch almost in a way.
Yeah.
And I want to say it's chapter 11 where you speak about um, renovating rather than rebuilding. And I think that
Hmm.
that's a really, really I love talking about unlearning. That's what a lot of what this
Yeah.
podcast is about. It's like
Yeah.
unlearning the habits and mindsets and everything that we kind of grew up with. But where do you think most people go wrong when it comes to unlearning things?
Yeah. So, well, one thing is that it's not even clear that we can unlearn. So, what I
Yeah.
mean by that is that there's, I would say, a prominent viewpoint among psychologists is that we don't actually unlearn anything. We don't actually forget anything. Now, I mean, there's probably some forgetting just in like the sense that, the memory is just decaying or whatever. But I mean to say, it's not like you can do something to erase a memory in the brain. What you're doing is you're building some new neural circuit that's going to override the old one.
Hmm.
And this can create problems because when you have two memories that are competing, in some cases, if you learn, let's say you learn one way to do a skill, and then you learn a new way to do the skill, in some ways they can compete in a way that makes you worse off if you're learning, like if you just had the old bad way of doing it.
Yeah.
And so the first lesson, particularly with, I would say, highly proceduralized skills that you sort of practice until they're perfect, that kind of skill, um, it's very important to try to get like kind of the right method from the beginning, right? Because if I'm going to play the piano, for instance, and I'm just sort of like, whatever, I'll just use my hands however I want to use it,
Hmm.
then I might adopt some way of playing the piano with my hands that is going to be very difficult to correct later if there is like some inefficiency about it, because that's how I've learned to press all the keys. An even more concrete example is learning to type on a computer. When I was in high school, I did a typing class. That was one of the classes that was offered, and they put a piece of paper over your hands so you can't see the keyboard and you have to type it, and you make lots of mistakes, but eventually you learn by touch where all of the keys are. And then you type like this with all of your your 8 fingers. You use the thumb for the space bar, and you're able to type much, much faster than you can if you're only using a couple fingers, or worse, you're like looking down and like hunting and pecking and this kind of thing. And so like if you want to be able to type 80 words a minute, you kind of can't do it with the other method. But if that's the method that you've been using, like I've talked to people who, they understand this, but they've been using the hunting and pecking method for like 30 years.
Hmm.
I mean, it's going to be a lot of work for them to try the touch typing and to force it, because they have such an ingrained habit to do this other thing. So that's the first lesson. Learn it the right way from the beginning. The second thing is if you are like me, because it's impossible to just always get it perfect from the get-go, if you do have to make modifications, often what you want to do is, again, like, how can I use what I have without like having this sort of total break, total like switch over and stuff. So I think sometimes, especially conceptually, the more you can kind of shift things, and then sometimes there's no way around it. You just have to rebuild a new system, and it will take a while. So there's a lot of research on intuitive physics, which is the idea that people come to the physics classroom with all these intuitions about how things move that don't correspond to physical laws, and that makes it hard to teach physics at a conceptual level. Basically, people make lots of mistakes with physics problems because they don't have a correct intuitions about these things, and then they learn these physics rules, which are kind of like a totally different representation. And so sometimes they start making worse mistakes because they use the physics laws wrong and they override their intuition in wrong ways, right? And so but there's just no way around it because the intuition is sort of supplied by nature or just sort of regular experience. So if you want to learn physics, you have to kind of, in some sense, learn this competing system that will override the intuitive one. And so for a lot of skills, that's the only way you can do it.
Yeah, man. I think skills are so important in life, yet we don't really they're not transferable, as I said earlier, and I think that's something that's really touched on throughout the book, that it's just a lot of the general knowledge that we have in a topic is going to be more powerful than being sufficient in a topic, it seems, in some way. When
Yeah.
you think of learning in general, you talk about the difficulty sweet spot, and I think a lot of people are always looking to either jump into something really, really difficult or jumping into something really, really easy so they can build competence in it. Where do you
Yeah.
find is the difficulty sweet spot?
Well, so the idea here is that there's a general pattern in a lot of learning research that shows that like interventions to that make something harder can have a different effect depending on where you are in the learning curve.
Mm,
So, like a simple example of that would be, well, like one of these ideas is retrieval, which we talked about. So, retrieval is this sort of effect, and I talked about it a lot in ultra learning. I had a whole chapter about it. But the idea is that practicing remembering something strengthens memory more than looking at it.
mhm,
So if I'm trying to remember a word in another language and I try to remember it and I recall it from memory, that kind of like that memory in my brain gets a much bigger signal strength boost than if I just showed it to you another time. And so this is why you want to do this kind of effortful practice. This is called a desirable difficulty because it makes learning harder, but it makes it more robust, more efficient. But there's obviously this kind of trade-off point because we talked about this earlier in a problem solving context. If you just solve like the hardest problem and you solve it by yourself, there's actually a point where you're going to do a lot better if you're studying the right way to solve the problem. So this
mhm.
obviously this has to be the case that this advice flips at some point. And it turns out that it's not just for this; it's for like lots and lots of things. There's sort of like kind of an optimal level of difficulty. And so a lot of what we're doing, I think, when we're trying to optimize our learning is trying to find this sweet spot, find this kind of fine tuning part. And so I have a few ways to suggest kind of honing in on that spot. So one of them is to sort of alternate between these three things of like seeing examples, doing practice, and getting feedback is one kind of way. Because if you're doing a loop, then you have the ability to calibrate it, like if you're pretty good, you just start by doing the practice and then you see you can just get the example part of the feedback. If you're just starting out, you're maybe seeing and you're like copying word for word. Like there's lots of ways you can fine tune that. But there's lots of ways that we can adjust the difficulties, sort of like ensure that we're growing or improving at the correct rate.
Man, this book in general was so in depth. Like I understand why it took a lot of years to write this book. I felt like I was going through and rereading a lot of the pages, a lot of the chapters even, and just really engulfing into all of the work. What do you feel out of all of the chapters you feel you were most excited about while writing?
Oh, well, I always get excited when you can tell a good story. So I think like my favorite chapter to write was the chapter about so practice must meet reality, where I talk about the twin Veldhuis and Van Zanten's the disaster at Tenerife, and also Major Smith-Berry's pilot training one. Because just sometimes you just like encounter a story and it's sort of like I don't even care about the takeaways. It's like I just love this story so much. And so I
Right.
just love that sort of contrast, the sort of, but I mean, that's me as a writer, just sort of like enjoying it. So I liked that one. I liked, uh, I liked The Fears Fade from Exposure. I really thought Samuel Rockman's work, which led me to other authors talking about the London Blitz, I thought was very interesting and important and surprising. Um, I mean, those are sort of stories I liked. But I mean, if we're talking about like theory, things that have had the biggest influence me from like the concepts of the book, I
Hmm.
mean, I definitely front loaded it. So the things that I thought were most important, I put front and center. So like the problem solving as search is probably the most important concept I think there is in learning. It doesn't have a lot of direct practical implications. So in some ways, it's a little bit underwhelming as a chapter because when I had to do the takeaways, I'm like, well, there's no really like takeaways for this yet, but like it's going to turn out to be important for understanding everything else. I think that was also something that was important for me because I think if you don't have that perspective when you're thinking about what learning is, it's very hard, I think, to approach learning, to approach skills. Like if you don't have this idea of the idea of a search space, the idea of how do you navigate that space, I think it's very hard to like even have the right mental model for thinking about learning.
Yeah, I like the way the book was structured because you're right. You need a
Oh, thank you.
basis for being able to use the takeaways from the book because later there's a bunch of takeaways in every single chapter, so it makes sense, and
Yeah, yeah,
it
yeah.
is definitely needed that way. I
Well, and
found
I oh sorry, I was just gonna say like the next chapter is talking about cognitive load theory, which is building on basically the problem solving
right.
chapter. So like I kind of can't like I could have maybe just had a section on problem solving at the beginning of that, but I felt like I felt like it was necessary to have that payoff because again I think like it to understand the difference between problem solving as an activity and remembering something, like these are sort of like fundamental distinctions that I think if you don't have that mental model, it's very hard to understand
Very,
what
very
this advice is saying. Yeah.
yeah, and you had a lot of stories that really give great examples too. Like you said, that's why I think it's so
No, thank you.
powerful. I find um I speak with a lot of authors on this podcast, and I find that the books that they get the most from aren't the ones that they read, but it's the ones that they write. I'm curious for
Mm,
you. This is a question I love to ask
yeah.
authors: is what book taught you more about yourself?
Like of this book or ultra learning, is that what we're
Yeah,
asking?
yeah.
Yeah. Hmm. I mean, they taught me different lessons, so I don't know. I feel like they were very different writing experiences.
Hmm.
Because with ultra learning, in some ways, the writing was a lot easier.
Hmm.
I was building on stories that I'd already experienced. I was compiling advice that I'd already given out many times before. Um, I hadn't written a traditionally published book before, so there was a lot of new processes there. Whereas I felt like with writing Get Better at Anything, I mean, I don't want to exaggerate too much, but it was a little bit like I want to know as much as like a PhD does in this subject. And so there was I think it was a lot more intellectual labor on this book. So the first book was sort of like taking my kind of stuff that I'd already learned elsewhere in assembly, and this one was sort of like, okay, wipe the slate clean and start from scratch again. And so I feel like the benefit for me for reading this book was really good because I feel like uh, learning and expertise in these kind of things is this kind of this iceberg situation that like maybe you only use that top 10% of the iceberg,
Hmm.
but it's supported by the weight of the other 90%. And I think that's something that I've come to appreciate more and more, that like when I read a book, I know whether that person is citing all the studies that they read or whether they're citing 1% of the studies they read because they're good illustrations of something that they have lots of other evidence to believe. And so I think to me the true experts are people who they can make a point, and maybe it's a fairly general point and it's something that other people can make, but it's just the weight of what's supporting it is much deeper. And I mean, it's a different kind of book too. Like ultra learning, it had that kind of weight, but it was much more personal. Like it was much more based on personal experiences. So I wouldn't say that it was unsupported. It was just had a different support.
Yeah. Yeah, there's so much value in this book that we didn't get to touch on.
Oh,
It
thank
just means that we're gonna have to have you on again in the future
you.
because your work is
Well,
powerful.
maybe in a couple of years I'll have a new book, and we'll have something new to talk about.
That's exactly it. I
Thank you.
love to ask my last question I ask every guest is what belief are you currently unlearning?
Oh, belief in my unlearning. This is a good question. I wouldn't say unlearning, but relearning. And I think this will take us back to the beginning of the conversation when I was saying things that I feel like uh, I feel like there is an idea that you just sort of learn things and then you know them. But often the biggest lessons in our life we have to keep telling ourselves. And I think that there was a space in my life when I was sort of a little bit more bold, willing to take on weird risks and doing things. And I think part of it is just getting older, having kids, having a mortgage. You get a little bit more conservative in your thinking. You're like, well, this will probably work. Let's do this again. And I feel like in some cases that's also the wrong move. That like, to use a startup term or finance term, you want to increase your optionality. Like basically, it's the things that really work that matter. Having a lot of like, especially with this kind of creative field, taking bigger risks is good. And so that means failure. That means doing things that don't work. And so I think the thing that I'm kind of relearning or trying to remind myself of is to not just get into that habit of just cranking out the same thing, and just to always give yourself new challenges and try new things. So that would be my answer for right now.
I love it, man. Thank you so much for coming on the show. All of your links to the book and your socials, of course, will be in the show notes. I appreciate your time immensely, and I'm definitely looking forward to when the next book comes out.
Oh, thank you so much. Thank you for reading.